If we look at people's identities in recovery, we're kind of struck. We find some differences. In community populations, if we ask people the question, are you a person in recovery from alcohol or drug addiction? Or did you once have the disease of addiction, but now you're in recovery from that disorder? We'll get a certain percentage of people who will say yes to that question. If we ask the question, did you once have a significant problem in your relationship with alcohol or drugs that you no longer have today? What do you think happens to the self-reported numbers? In the second group, the numbers jump. And if we actually look at which of those individuals met DSM-4 criteria for a substance use disorder, there are a lot of people who met DSM-4 criteria for a substance use disorder who do not self-identify as a person in recovery, including many of you in this room who probably were diagnostically appropriate during your college years. So what I mean by that is technically someone is in recovery, diagnostically, but there's someone who does not acknowledge themselves or have not incorporated that into their identity. We have people with extremely positive pro-recovery identities. These are people, if you bump into them at the grocery store as strangers, they tell you their recovery story in the aisle. They are not only in recovery, they're ready to let the world know they're in recovery. This was particularly notorious in my early days of coming out of ex-addict-directed therapeutic communities. We created a generation of super ex-dope fiend folk heroes. And we were basically paid to run around the country spieling the story of how we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and all that kind of nonsense. I think it's also important to note there's another category here, and that's people who are in recovery but are deeply ashamed of that status because of the incredible social stigma that continues related to that. And I'm going to be very blunt. There are a number of those individuals who may hide behind vague rhetoric about anonymity as a spiritual tradition. But the bottom line is they're ashamed. Given their level of functioning, given their status within the culture, it would be extremely difficult for them to acknowledge. I'm not talking about acknowledging affiliation with a 12-step program. I'm talking about acknowledging themselves as a person in recovery. I want to tell you how pervasive. I'm one of the most out people, probably, in this country. And I can run around with my big Recovery March t-shirt, right? And I get home from a march, and my dear wife Rita says, "Can you run to the store for me?" And I say, "Sure." And without thinking, now this is decades now, I pulled my recovery t-shirt off and threw a sloppy old plain t-shirt on, and I'm about to walk out the door, and all of a sudden it hits me. I won't say the word, did I just do? And all of a sudden it realizes this stuff is insidious. That it just keeps creeping back in. That I'm okay as a person in recovery when I'm surrounded by 15,000 people in recovery, but I'm a bit embarrassed to walk down the aisles of my local grocery store with a recovery celebration t-shirt on. That's how insidious some of this stuff gets to be. Obviously, there are changes in these statuses over time as people get into recovery. Styles of recovery, interpersonal styles. We have acultural styles, meaning individuals who initiate and sustain recovery without relationships with other people in recovery. Acultural. They do not relate to the culture of recovery in the United States. We have people who have a bicultural style, meaning they can operate within distinct communities of recovery and master the language and the etiquette and all the nuances of those fellowships. But they can also spend a lot of time and function quite comfortably with people that in the recovery community are called earth people or civilians or normies. They're bicultural. They're very fluid in terms of their ability to move back and forth. And of course, we have some people who are deeply enmeshed in the culture of recovery, in fact, live inside the culture of recovery so exclusively that they almost have no contact with the mainstream culture. This is particularly true of people who come out of deeply enmeshed styles of addiction and deeply enmeshed in particularly illicit drug cultures. Now, we also obviously have changes in these styles over time. Culturally enmeshed styles are not unusual for people in early recovery. It's part of a safety net and a sanctuary, if you will. But in some circumstances, this individual is going to go to a sponsor or whatever the mentor in a different recovery fellowship would be and make a suggestion that maybe they need to attend even more meetings. And you're going to have a sage person in recovery say, you know what? I actually think you need to attend less meetings. In fact, I've got a new recovery program for you, and it's called Get a Life Program. And it's about time you stopped hiding within these rooms and began to go out and build a life of recovery in the larger community. My point with this is that we're beginning to see tremendous heterogeneity, incredible diversity around styles and frameworks of long-term recovery across these secular, spiritual, and religious frameworks.